Yeah, first short welcome everybody. We're about to get started, but it will still be a few minutes. If you like, you can send a short message to everybody in the chat field, and then I'll be back in a few minutes. Good. I think now is the time to open this session. My name is Kenneth. I think I'd like to see a slide about interpretation for as a start. Can we get that up? There you go. I think some of you may have seen this before. This is just to make sure that you know that there is the option of getting interpretation in several languages. And then let's go. My name is Kenneth, Kenneth Har. I've been trusted with the task of taking you through the next 1.5 hours discussion on, well, the next session, today's event, Municipalize Europe. And this will be about housing. Some would call it the big issue. I remember that on the streets of London in the old days, perhaps that's still the case, that homeless would sell magazines called The Big Issue and earn a small income from that. We will be talking about homelessness, but not just that. We will look at housing in a broad perspective. We will be discussing the issue of financial speculation, the fact that it's becoming more and more difficult for all of us with a normal income to get a affordable housing, and not least in cities. And we will look at it from a city perspective. What can you do from the local level? How can a municipalist agenda be used to deal with the problem of access to affordable housing? We will look at some particular experiences, what has been achieved already in past years, and what can be done going forward. So I guess it's fair to say that our starting point will be the city level, but we will look just a little bit at the European level as well. There are important political agendas unfolding at the European level, and several of the speakers would mention that as we go along. About the speakers, I know it's a bit of a cliche coming from a facilitator, but we really do have a fantastic panel today for different speakers, each with their perspective, and really, I mean, um, um, big names, so to speak. Just briefly, we have Lucia Martin, counselor in Barcelona. You have MICHAELA from the city of Vienna, LEILANI FARHA, from former UN Special Rapporteur on adequate housing and former housing activists, and Kim van SPARRENTAK from the GroenLinks, a member of the European Parliament. You will hear more about them a little later, and they will get a more thorough introduction. Um, um, about the agenda, this is how we'll do it. Each speaker will have approximately 10 minutes. There will be a short session in between the speakers, but generally questions and answers will be at the end of this session. So roughly the last half hour will be your questions and comments. But don't hesitate to write them down when we start. There's a Q&A field at the bottom of your screens. There you can enter your questions and they will be picked up and organized by two helping hands, Melissa and Jess, who will then help me take care of the last session. But then let's get to it. The first two speakers will each represent, so to speak, two cities in Europe. Two cities that I find extremely interesting when it comes to housing for very different reasons. And we will be starting with Lucia Martin, who is, as I said, the counselor in Barcelona, a previous housing activist from the PAH, what I think one of the most exciting movements in Spain, or actually in Europe, that we've seen in recent years. And Lucia has as well. You were a member of the Spanish Congress, and there you did work on rent regulation reform. So this is the first one on the scene. Is quite a name. I'm very interested in hearing your presentation. Over to you, Lucia.
Bueno, buenas tardes y muchas gracias, y gracias también por esta presentación tan generosa. Sobre todo, agradecer a las que están organizando este encuentro tan necesario para nosotros, ¿no? Para las ciudades, para compartir en estos espacios es clave. Agradecer al Corporate Europe Observatory, al TNI, al grupo de los Verdes Europeos y a Cataluña en Comú por permitirnos compartir este espacio, porque yo creo que eso es imprescindible, que las ciudades y básicamente aquellas personas que estamos, digamos, muy cerca del día a día de nuestras vecinas y que sabemos qué problemas están sufriendo cada día, y en un momento, digamos, este punto de inflexión, ¿no?, que estamos viviendo todas con el COVID, donde la vivienda, digamos, se ha convertido en el primer espacio de protección, ¿no?, de nuestras vecinas, porque les estamos diciendo que se queden en casa, ¿no? Es más importante que nunca poner en el centro el derecho a la vivienda y compartir, pues, qué estrategias, qué políticas, ¿no?, en qué momento y qué queremos impulsar, básicamente porque estamos en un lugar privilegiado, pero a la vez hay que reconocerlo. Muchas veces somos las que menos competencias legislativas tenemos, las que menos presupuesto tenemos, por lo tanto, por eso es más importante que nunca compartir, estar conectadas, trabajar en red y apoyarnos para conseguir aquello por lo que estamos trabajando, ¿no? Yo creo que muchas compartimos algunos de los temas, ¿no?, que son claves en el debate público sobre la vivienda. Una de ellas es la regulación de precios de los alquileres. Hay ciudades, pues, que llevan muchos años, ¿no?, con sistemas de regulación de precios, y aquí tenemos a Nueva York, tenemos a Berlín, ¿no?, tenemos a París, que recientemente pues, ha conseguido impulsar un sistema de regulación de precios. Desde Barcelona, hace 5 años, ¿no?, que reclamábamos esta regulación de precios de los alquileres en vistas de la especulación brutal que había con los precios. Finalmente hemos aprobado, en Cataluña se ha aprobado una ley catalana para la regulación de los precios de los alquileres, gracias al impulso, y eso hay que reconocerlo y ponerlo en valor, de los movimientos sociales que en la calle también han estado trabajando para hacer la realidad. Esta es una de los ítems imprescindibles que tienen que estar en el debate por el derecho a la vivienda hoy. Evidentemente, otro de los puntos que compartimos, ya digo, a diferentes velocidades, ¿no?, porque hay ciudades que tienen una tradición en políticas de vivienda que ya nos gustaría en Barcelona tener, ¿no?, y aquí pienso también en Viena, y hablo ahora del parque de vivienda pública, ¿no? En Barcelona tenemos un parque de vivienda pública muy, muy diminuto y estamos haciendo un esfuerzo increíble desde hace 5 años para hacerlo crecer, el parque de vivienda pública en alquiler, pero también trabajando con actores privados dispuestos a hacer vivienda asequible y con alianzas público-comunitarias para desarrollar ese tejido de cooperativas, ¿no?, que en otros países está mucho más, mucho más ya constituido. Nosotras estamos empezando a dar pasos en ese sentido, ¿no? Entonces, algunas de las cuestiones que hemos estado trabajando en estos 5 últimos años que a mí me parecen relevantes, ¿no?, como políticas de innovación en materia de vivienda y políticas singulares, más allá de, ya digo, un impulso brutal nunca visto en la ciudad antes al parque público de vivienda en alquiler. Para que os hagáis una idea, solo el año que viene tendremos más de 2.000 viviendas construyéndose en la ciudad. Eso significa que nuestro compromiso con el derecho a la vivienda no es solo retórico, que también, evidentemente, que es importante situar el relato del derecho a la vivienda, ¿no? Y olvidarnos de la mercantilización de la vivienda, que es lo que habíamos oído durante décadas y décadas. Más allá del relato y del protagonismo central de las políticas de vivienda, el compromiso también es presupuestario, para ser capaces de generar ese parque público que no tenemos en la ciudad y todas esas viviendas de alquiler que nunca se han hecho como hasta ahora. Tenemos detrás un presupuesto que nunca había existido. Pero más allá de eso, más allá del impulso al parque público, otra de las medidas que a mí me parecen relevantes y que también se fijan, están inspiradas en medidas que ya están en marcha en otras ciudades europeas, es el 30%, ¿no? Esa medida que exige corresponsabilidad a los privados. Creo que este concepto también es clave en este momento, ¿no? No podemos dejar que se instale el relato de que la respuesta a los problemas de vivienda de la ciudadanía solo tienen que venir de la administración pública. Eso no es cierto. No podemos aspirar a solucionar este problema estructural solo desde lo público y, por lo tanto, es necesario la corresponsabilidad de aquellos actores privados. Nosotras hemos puesto en marcha esta medida del 30% para que cualquier gran rehabilitación o nueva construcción de vivienda privada reserve un 30% de sus viviendas a precios asequibles. Eso ha sido muy difícil aprobarlo y también ha sido gracias al impulso de los movimientos sociales y la ciudadanía. Otras cuestiones en las que hemos innovado ha sido la creación de una unidad especializada en la prevención de los desahucios. No sé si lo sabéis, pero ahora mismo estamos luchando cada día en las calles junto con los vecinos y vecinas con esta unidad antidesahucios para evitar los desahucios de personas vulnerables que se están produciendo a pesar de la pandemia, y estamos luchando para conseguir que desde el Gobierno del Estado se vuelva a decretar una suspensión total de los desahucios de personas vulnerables. Pero mientras eso no ocurre, esta unidad especializada que creamos en 2015 y que ya ha acompañado más de 10.000 casos, pues está semanalmente parando casi el 90% de los desahucios, ¿no? También creamos una unidad antiacoso, ¿no? Eso no existía. A partir de 2015 creamos esta unidad antiacoso y antimalas prácticas, ¿no? Que básicamente detecta prácticas de acoso inmobiliario, de pisos vacíos. Todo eso eran malas prácticas que estaban muy instaladas después de 40 años de malas políticas de vivienda, y estamos empezando a darle la vuelta, ¿no? Desde que estalló el COVID, como decía, y lo compartimos todas, ¿no? El derecho a la vivienda, si antes estaba amenazado, ahora ha pasado a ser una cuestión de salud pública, ¿no? Porque no tener una vivienda directamente pone en riesgo más que nunca tu salud. Desde Barcelona implementamos una moratoria, ¿no? De los desahucios de parque público. No se desahucia nadie que viva en el parque público. Hemos implementado ayudas extraordinarias para pagar los alquileres del parque público. Otra cuestión que ha aparecido con fuerza es qué pasa con la vivienda turística en nuestras ciudades, ¿no? Que durante años ha estado colonizando espacios, ha estado colonizando viviendas residenciales, ¿no? Detrayéndolas de ese mercado de vivienda asequible en el que nos harían tanta falta. Durante años, llevamos ya 5 años luchando, ¿no? Contra estos alquileres turísticos ilegales, con normativas que nunca se habían puesto en marcha en la ciudad, y ahora estamos intentando trabajar con esos propietarios de viviendas turísticas para que sean capaces de poner en alquiler asequible, ¿no? Hemos ofrecido un acuerdo para alquilar esas viviendas a precios asequibles y poder ponerlas a disposición de familias vulnerables. No es sencillo, porque ciertamente lo que estamos detectando es que muchos de estos propietarios están haciendo una especie de alquileres fraudulentos, ¿no? En lugar de dar alquileres estables y asequibles, están haciendo falsos alquileres de temporada, ¿no? Como de 1 año, de 6 meses, y ahí tenemos que tener capacidad de incidir, ¿no? Nosotras estamos intentando que haya un cambio legislativo a nivel catalán para poder inspeccionar y sancionar esas malas prácticas y recuperar esas viviendas que pertenecían al mercado turístico para que pasen al alquiler residencial a precios asequibles. Pero para acabar un poco y no alargarme, yo creo que estamos en un momento clave también, con una oportunidad con estos fondos europeos, Y aquí sí que las ciudades yo creo que tenemos que ser exigentes, ¿no? Nosotras recientemente hemos cerrado un acuerdo con el gobierno del Estado en el que por primera vez en la historia el gobierno está financiando la promoción de alquiler público de una ciudad directamente, sin pasar por la región. Pues en cierta manera tenemos que hacer algo parecido, tenemos que conseguir interlocutar directamente, ¿no? Que las ciudades tengan una vía de interlocución directa, aunque sea parcial, aunque no sea para todos los fondos, pero conseguir tener una vía de interlocución directa para la gestión de esos fondos, para tener acceso a esa gestión. Otra cosa que me parece importante sobre estos fondos del Next Generation es que evidentemente están enfocados en gran medida a la rehabilitación de vivienda, eso es clave, lo sabemos, en nuestra ciudad tenemos un parque público de alquiler especialmente que digamos, está energéticamente ineficiente y poco cuidado durante décadas, por lo tanto estos fondos son una oportunidad, pero hay que ir con mucho cuidado y hay que ir con mucho cuidado porque sabemos que las políticas de rehabilitación se han utilizado o han servido muchas veces para expulsar a aquellos vecinos y vecinas con menos capacidad de renta, para generar procesos de gentrificación y no podemos permitir que estos fondos europeos caigan en el mismo error, ¿no? Tenemos que garantizar alquileres asequibles y en todo caso incentivos para que los propietarios rehabiliten y adecuen sus viviendas sin desproteger a los inquilinos y a las inquilinas. Y sobre todo, que estas ayudas para rehabilitación vayan dirigidas también o tengan un componente claro social. No puede ser que aquellas comunidades más vulnerables económicamente, más vulnerables socialmente, que tradicionalmente quedan fuera de las convocatorias de ayudas a la rehabilitación, no se vean directamente beneficiadas de estos fondos. En Barcelona tenemos programas pioneros que están dirigidos a rehabilitar precisamente ese tipo de viviendas y acompañar esas comunidades que tendrían dificultades para llevar a cabo un proceso de rehabilitación de una finca, que no es sencillo, es muy complejo, hay que poner de acuerdo a mucha gente. Y yo creo que esos programas que hemos puesto en marcha aquí nos marcan también un camino de perspectiva social en la rehabilitación de vivienda. Dos cosas más para acabar. Tenemos que ser capaces de ir más allá en cuestión de fiscalidad, ¿no? No podemos estar siempre, olvidarnos de esta parte, ¿no? De la corresponsabilidad de los privados, o sea, no podemos, digamos, hacer el máximo esfuerzo desde lo público sin ser exigentes con los privados. Hemos tenido una fiscalidad que pone la alfombra roja a la especulación y en cambio que dificulta muchísimo a aquellos privados que quieren hacer, por ejemplo, vivienda asequible. Entonces, tenemos que encontrar algún tipo de marco tributario común que impida la fiscalidad especulativa y en cambio que facilite una fiscalidad que esté dirigida a generar y a gestionar vivienda a precios asequibles, ¿no? Y ahí tenemos que forzar un marco desde todas las ciudades. Y por último, yo creo que a la Unión Europea, ¿no? A estos fondos, pero en general al plan de inversiones de la Unión Europea, hay que seguir pidiéndoles financiación, capacidad de financiación. Nosotras no podríamos estar impulsando toda la vivienda pública que estamos haciendo en Barcelona si no fuera por el papel del Banco Europeo de Inversiones, porque ciertamente la banca tradicional no financia, al menos en España, vivienda pública de alquiler de forma masiva. Sería imposible continuar con el plan que tenemos en Barcelona si no fuera por la financiación europea y por eso debe verse reforzada. Necesitamos que los estados tengan una inversión pública en vivienda muy fuerte. Ahora en España, si todo va bien, se aprobará un presupuesto estatal que nunca antes había existido. Esto es gracias a los fondos europeos y por lo tanto necesitamos que estos fondos continúen manteniéndose porque las ciudades necesitamos el presupuesto de vivienda como agua de mayo. Si no hay dinero, no hay políticas de vivienda y eso también tenemos que repetirlo y repetirlo para que Europa lo tenga en cuenta. Y yo lo dejaría aquí porque si no me enrollaré como una persiana y así escucho a mis compañeras.
Great, thanks a lot. Yeah, I have to follow the schedule, but I'd like to squeeze in just a few questions before we turn over to MICHAELA. One is, and I had the chance to look a bit at a bit bigger at the social housing projects in Barcelona a couple of years ago, and already then it looked as if it would be a very difficult process. What I'm wondering is, when trying to build up a social housing sector in Barcelona, do you work together with other municipalities? Do you dig into experiences from other European countries? Or is this something you have to invent yourself?
¿Me oye? No, claro, nosotras cuando estamos impulsando el parque público de la ciudad, básicamente nos fijamos en cómo han trabajado en otras ciudades, ¿no? Por eso, de ahí lo que el aprendizaje que nosotras hemos hecho es que tenemos un déficit inmenso, ¿no?, con respecto a otras ciudades europeas en lo que se refiere a parque de vivienda pública en alquiler, porque durante décadas en España, esto a veces es difícil entender desde fuera, pero la vivienda pública que se hacía no era de alquiler, era de venta, con lo cual ha habido millones y millones y millones de euros públicos invertidos en una vivienda que ahora ya no es pública, ya no está y cada año se pierde. Con lo cual, los aprendizajes que hemos hecho mirando otras ciudades europeas es, uno, es necesario un impulso fortísimo público para incrementar el parque público de vivienda, pero con eso no es suficiente, ¿no? Tenemos que trabajar con una diversidad de actores que aquí digamos, está empezando a coger músculo, que en otras ciudades de Europa está muy consolidado, como por ejemplo el sector de cooperativas en cesión de uso. Eso es un aprendizaje, ¿no?, que hacemos, por ejemplo, de ciudades como Viena, ¿no?, que tiene un parque público fuerte, pero también existe esta colaboración con privados, con sectores comunitarios que son capaces de promover y gestionar vivienda en alquiler o vivienda en otras, digamos, figuras de cesión de uso, pero a precios asequibles, ¿no? Sabemos que el impulso del parque público debe ser fuerte, pero que no podemos hacerlo solas y que debemos, digamos, trabajar con estas comunidades, con estos otros actores privados que aquí están empezando a surgir, porque no existía esa tradición, ¿no?, y que también desde lo público hay que, digamos, ayudarles a aparecer, y ese es uno de los aprendizajes que hemos hecho y que estamos implementando después de ver pues otras ciudades que tienen mucha más tradición de la que teníamos nosotras.
One other question. I have a soft spot for the whole debate on how to deal with Airbnb, with short-term rental platforms, and I've tried to follow the experience of Barcelona. About a year ago, I spoke to an official from Barcelona, and his message was a bit troubling, in that he said that we've come a long way in Barcelona regulating short-term rental housing, but we are really coming to the end of where the competence of this city lies. So that will be a question to you. Are you running out of tools?
Bueno, más que quedarnos sin herramientas, es que, digamos, se nos abren otros problemas, ¿no? Llevamos 5 años luchando contra el alquiler turístico ilegal y ahora lo que ocurre es, por una parte, ya no solo son los pisos turísticos, sino que ahora el mercado, digamos, turístico, claro, ahora con el COVID todo esto ha cambiado un poco, ¿no? Pero lo que está ocurriendo es que se estaba empezando a girar hacia las habitaciones turísticas. Ya no hablamos de viviendas, sino que ahora hay como un agujero legal que permite el alquiler por habitaciones, ¿no? Y ahí también estábamos viendo muchos abusos. Por lo tanto, necesitamos nuevas herramientas para enfrentar, uno, el problema de las habitaciones, y otro tema es el de las viviendas turísticas, que son legales, ¿no?, que tienen su licencia. Desde 2011 el gobierno regional lo que hizo fue que estas licencias turísticas son perpetuas, es decir, nunca caducan. El día que la consigues es de por vida, ¿no? Es una aberración que en una ciudad que hay tanta falta de vivienda a precios asequibles, hoy en día tenemos más de 9.000 viviendas turísticas legales con una licencia perpetua, ¿no? En ese sentido, en el ayuntamiento ya estamos trabajando, y eso lo tenemos que hacer en coordinación, ¿no?, en acuerdo con el gobierno regional, porque esto no se sostiene y no podemos continuar avalando este tipo de políticas, ¿no? En el que simplemente se detraen para toda la vida miles y miles y miles y miles de viviendas que podrían estar alquilándose a precios asequibles. Pero esto no lo podemos hacer solo desde el ayuntamiento, sino que tenemos que acordarlo con el gobierno regional, con el gobierno autonómico de Cataluña.
Great. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Lucia. We should now go to Vienna, to Michaela from the city of Vienna, based in Brussels. There's so many interesting things about Michaela and about her city. Vienna is famous for its large stock of social housing, and I know that there are many things going on in the area of regulation of short-term rental housing platforms. 10 minutes, Michaela.
I'm still muted. No, it's okay now. Okay, good. Thank you so much for organizing this event. I really appreciate it. And before I start with my little contribution to this, I've just scrolled a little bit through the list of participants, and it's amazing how many people have joined us. I'm really happy about that. And I just want to, because Vienna has just been hit by a very, very, very hard attack. We've never thought that our beautiful, wonderful city would have to experience such a thing. And we've received so many messages of comfort and solidarity that really helped us a little to do better with this sadness that we experience now. And I know that some people are here today who come from those cities who have sent us the messages. So let me thank you really from the bottom of my heart for your solidarity. That's really, really good. Well, work helps always if you're sad. So let's work on housing. Let's work on affordable housing. And a lot has already been, kicked off by Lucia here. I'm not going to repeat many of the things. She's very, very right on all of these. And Barcelona and Vienna are, by the way, in the lead of the working group housing of Eurocities, the network of big European cities since many years. So we are like this on many topics. And what I think when we related the whole topic of affordable housing now a little bit more also to the COVID-19 crisis, because this is also a little bit more the topic of the event today. I think one lesson that we can draw is where we do see systems which are very strong state intervention in the housing sector, systems with a very strong share or a big share of social, public, cooperative, municipal, for limited profit housing, with a strong intervention to also regulate the private sector, be it the homeowners, the affordable home ownership, be it the rental sector. In those cities, typically, you will cope better with crisis situations. We have learned this already when we look back 2008, 2009, when the whole financial crisis started. We saw that resilient housing systems are systems where state intervention is strong and solid and sustainable. And I think this is a little bit the lesson that we can share from Vienna. Before COVID, we had about 150 groups per year coming to Vienna to explore how we do it with, how do you do it in Vienna with housing? Now that has obviously stopped for a while, but it very often then we were saying, listen, guys, maybe it's not a good idea to come to Vienna because you do not have 100 years time. Maybe you should go to Dublin or Barcelona to see how they are doing, because they are starting from a completely different basic situation. And they're doing, in fact, partly some of the things that we have been setting up 100 years ago. So I'm not trying to make people sad, but it's sometimes maybe easier to compare the right thing. And in time, looking back in time, I think What we started in Vienna more than 100 years ago was to really see that housing is a right. The market does not deliver. Therefore, intervention in the market is necessary. And that has, since ever, only with the interruption of the fascist regime and the Nazis and World War II, since then we have continued on this path. In Vienna, I'm quite sure that, I hope that, because I'm talking about this all the time, it should be common knowledge globally now. But in Vienna, 64%, nearly 2/3 of the people live in either social, public, municipal, cooperative, or for limited profit housing. And that also includes housing in the private rental sector, where we have, for instance, put subsidies to renovate, to reorganize, to refurbish the buildings. So in any moment where, for instance, we put public money, public subsidies into a private undertaking, we would also do this not for nothing. We want to have binding conditions, and all those who receive public money have to follow the rules that we set. One of the youngest interventions we have set in the housing sector in Vienna was to introduce a new zoning law, in March 2019, that defined that in any new urban development project, you have to have 2/3 of the housing produced there for social and affordable housing. What we also did, because money is really super important, and Lucia was making that point, how do you get the money for it? But also, how do you not lose the money? When we're talking today about the issue of how strong municipal services should and must be, especially in times of crisis. Keep your land, do not sell it off. This is my recommendation. Use the instrument of long-term lease. Use the instrument of contracts, urban development contracts with your partners in the project. Use absolutely any means not to lose the control over the ground, because this is one of the main cost drivers that we have seen now in the whole housing crisis that we have to overcome as cities, where and I know that, for instance, the topography of Barcelona is not favoring that, because you nearly have no land reserves. In Vienna, we are a little bit better off, but still also in Vienna, we have to set these kind of strong interventions in the market in order to account for the need of a growing population. We are going to be like 2 million in a few years. And that's really something where we need to provide for a lot of infrastructure. And Kenneth, I'm looking at you, but I would like to talk 2 minutes more, if that's okay.
2 minutes is fine.
Okay. Talking about strong intervention, I think what we also should see is the whole set of policy instruments that we have in Vienna is also based, when I come back to housing as a right, and you have to, as a state or as a city, if you really take that serious, you also have to talk about participation. And there's also a very basic economic argument to it. Very often, we have this idea that we need the money from the EU, we need the money from the EIB. Okay, then we have maybe some regional and national and local funds. And then we have some money coming from some tax system, yeah, like in Austria. But what we nearly always forget in these discussions is there's one group that really pays constantly, and that's the tenants. And that's the people living in those places and in those homes. And I think opening a little bit the argument for participation from the perspective who's paying, it's not only about the big stakeholders, it's not only about the big funds, it's not only about the banks, it's not only about this and that, big transnational, international investor, it's the people who use it. So I think that this is something where we have really developed a lot of policy instruments around that really prove that we take it serious to, account for housing as a right, like protection of tenants. It doesn't happen like falling from the sky. Yeah, You have to, for instance, support tenants' organizations. You have to help people setting up their own neighborhood centers and organizations. You have to take tenants' organizations as social partners or as legitimate partners when you, for instance, renegotiate rent law and rent regulation. You have to set up low threshold legal disputes settlement procedures and processes, because the tenant or even the a small homeowner, they will always be on the weaker side of the legal fights. So we have to help those people to keep their places where they live, where they want to get old, and where they want to have their children, where they want to do all the things that one wants to do in life. And let me just make one last remark on that. The best, of course, protection of tenants is not only rent caps, rent control, tenants protection, etc. It's also to create a level playing field between tenants and homeowners. And what do I mean by this? The homeowner will have his flat for his whole life. Why should not the tenant have that same right? And this is something where I think there we can really make the case for unlimited contracts. This will not only be intelligent and wise, because people will have some feeling of ownership of the building and of the place where they live. It's more, psychological ownership. They will take care of it. They will see that everybody's getting along well. So this is, I'm coming from Vienna. We're all little, psychologists here. So that means that we really try to make the circumstances easy for people to get along well together. Doesn't mean that we don't have any problems. We are not, paradise. I've said it in the beginning, but still, I think that social cohesion and social mix in our city has one main effect. And that means that in Vienna, people are not ashamed to live in public housing or in municipal or in social housing. People are proud to live that. And people have set up theaters in our municipal housing company. We have chorus who have been singing throughout the Corona crisis. We have musicians who have played music throughout the Corona crisis. We have TV series going on, playing there. We have, municipal housing in Vienna is something where you're proud of. It's not a discriminating thing to live in municipal housing. It's something where you have to be proud of. And I think this is the lesson also to be taken up by the European Union when they design all the policies that I think Kim is going to talk about. Thank you so much.
There's not so much space before the next speaker, but I would like to challenge you a bit on, you say you don't live in paradise, but it really does sound as if you do on some points. Vienna is remarkable in many ways. So just a quick question. 2/3 of the people live in social housing or something similar, and you have zoning laws where you obligate developers to include 2/3 of it should be on social housing conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Do you not have, does that kind of social housing approach not have political enemies in Austria?
I hope so. I know it's a fight. That's very clear. And I know that they are going to challenge us on this very clearly. Our city councillor for housing, Katrin Gahl, has, in the moment when we decided this in the city council, they were already starting to, say, okay, we're waiting, let's do it. But I think that if we really take it serious and if we say housing is a right, we have to take care of that. We have this goal of social mix, of social cohesion in our city. So we need to have instruments. And we are using this now. It's only starting because you may know that zoning takes a long time. It's a long and participatory procedure. But bringing that on the way, it's not the only measure, by the way. We are building at the moment 4,000, nearly 5,000 municipal new flats. We are having 14,000 flats in total under construction in Vienna. So we're really trying our best. We know it's not enough. And we really need more support to do it. But given the construction grounds, the land costs, the building ground costs, we have to do something, because otherwise we will never be able to house all the people who live here.
Thank you very much. Just a reminder before we move on that if you have questions or comments, write them down in the Q&A slot at the bottom of your screen, and then we can return to them after the next two speakers. So I will now turn to LEILANI FARHA who is, she was once a former Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing, UN Special Rapporteur, and she is now the director of an exciting group called The Shift, with an interesting political program that I hope that we will hear more about. LEILANI, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I feel I am in such good company. I am just enjoying myself immensely. So thank you, Lucia, for leading us off, and MICHAELA for your comments. I think our comments, all three of us, our comments really fit with each other, and I'm sure when Kim comes to, it will be the same. I want to make one political comment before I start my, and it's a little bit off. It's not about housing, but I will say that I am using Zoom because I have to, and not because I want to. I don't know if any of you have followed, but Zoom has been engaging in censorship, particularly in the United States, and the ability of people to host pro-Palestinian speakers using Zoom. And I reject this categorically as a violation of free expression. And I just want to say that. I use it because I have to. So let me talk a little bit about why I think it's so important that cities engage the affordable housing crisis. And then I'm going to turn just at the end for a little bit about the EU as a whole. It's not my expertise, so I'll leave that to Kim, but I'll just weigh in a little bit there. So of course, as we've heard from Lucia and MICHAELA, cities have no choice. The housing crisis is on their doorstep, and they have no choice but to act and to deal with what has been presented to them, what is manifesting, and in some cases, what they have contributed to. But cities do have a choice as to how they act and how they respond to this crisis. And that's the most important thing at this point. I think in my experience talking to cities from around the world, what is very clear amongst many is that old models don't work. Old models don't work, and the pandemic has exposed that bare. It's made it very plain if it wasn't plain before. Many of us felt it was very obvious before, but the pandemic absolutely has exposed that. And what has it exposed? It has exposed that there's a paradox. Rich cities and rich countries have alarmingly high rates of homelessness and are increasing. As the city gets richer, as some people associated with the city or country get richer, homelessness increases. What else have we seen? We've seen the dominance of big financial actors coming into the housing landscape, whether it's private equity firms, whether it's in other investors, asset management companies, all of whom are profit driven. We've seen migrants and refugees really having the most deplorable housing conditions, really being left out of the housing equation, out of the housing system. And we see people struggling just to pay the rent, affordability no longer realistic in so many cities, people paying, month by month, clinging to their tenancies. So obviously the system isn't working. That's just clear. And what's also obvious to me as a human rights lawyer and thinker and advocate is that all of this is a denial of human rights. And so we need obviously a new approach. And MICHAELA talked about this. In fact, for Vienna, it's an old approach, but for most cities, I love that. We should be comparing properly. For most cities, we need a very new approach, one that is sustainable. And I obviously advocate for the human rights approach and a human rights housing system, because only the human rights framework addresses inequalities, discrimination, preserves dignity, focuses, as MICHAELA said, so important, and as Lucia's examples exposed, focuses on people, households, rather than finance and markets. That's the human rights approach. And that's what makes it so important and so powerful at this moment in contemporary history. And what human rights does is it forces this as a matter of obligation. It's not just a matter of charity or goodwill. It's a matter of obligation. Cities have international human rights obligations, as do states. And those human rights obligations attach to housing. And the human rights framework does this, requires accountability. Because when a state has an obligation, they have to be held accountable to that obligation. When a city has an obligation, they have to be accountable to that obligation. Now, if we can all agree that maybe there's something in a human rights approach, it's not just good enough to say, oh yes, we believe housing's a human right. Yay, we're going to do a whole bunch of things and we hope that this is in keeping with this knowledge that housing is a human right. What I would suggest is a much more systematic human rights approach, where cities, as well as national governments, adopt rights-based housing strategies. And the strategies then bring together all the different pieces. You heard when Lucia was talking, there are a lot of moving pieces. It's Airbnb, it's a lack of social housing, it's financial actors, it's the banks, it's evictions, it's poor wages. There are a lot of moving pieces. You need some umbrella under which you put all of these policies, and the umbrella provides you with your goals and outcomes, what you're striving for. And then all of your policies and decision-making at city level should have human rights outcomes. So I'm going to give you an example with my time of something that I've initiated at a local level here in Canada that I think could give us some inspiration as well, even though Canada is not like, the cities in Canada are not quite like Barcelona, Berlin, or Vienna in terms of their, they're not known for their incredible progressive actions, but we do have some real burgeoning movements at city level. When the pandemic struck, I actually assumed cities around the world and national governments around the world would immediately move to adopt emergency rights-based legislation and strategies in the area of housing. I felt that because home was the prescription and is the prescription, I assumed there would be an immediate emergency move for legislation and policies that address housing in the face of the pandemic. This didn't happen. We got a smattering of policies everywhere. You see, eviction moratorium over here and rent freeze over there, but we didn't get, full-on strategies around housing from a human rights point of view. So in Canada, what we decided was to host a roundtable and just invite any cities that were interested in having a discussion about the emergency, the pandemic, and the emergency housing crisis. We just thought, let's see what happens. They knew me as a human rights leader in the country, and I joined with an urbanist, the Canadian Urban Institute, and we just hosted this roundtable. Well, lo and behold, 12 cities came to the table like that, including mayors, city councillors, and housing departments. We opened it to everyone. At first, it was what I would call a grumble fest. Everyone just complaining. We don't know what to do. Homelessness is a problem. How do we protect our homeless population from COVID? We don't have social housing. We don't have this, we don't have that. Fast forward 3 months later, they have become a cohesive group. They've named themselves the Right to Home Municipal Working Group. They now have a call to action, which I hope someone in my team will put in the chat. And it's a very rights-based call to action. What we learned from this experience was a few things. One, there is huge appetite for a new way forward. Two, there's huge appetite for our human rights way forward on the housing file. Three, human rights empower cities to do what they actually want to do. They don't want homelessness in their streets. They don't want people to live in housing precarity, to feel that they might be evicted any moment. They want people to be able to afford existing and available housing. And so those were amazing revelations. But the fourth and sort of final revelation was that cities can't do it alone, and human rights give them a leverage with the national level government, because national level government has human rights obligations as well. So cities could use their desire to do the right thing, to do human rights, to say, hey, if you don't enable me, the city, to do human rights, I put the human rights record of the entire nation at risk. If you don't give me the resources, the capacity, the legislative power to do what's necessary to implement the right to housing, then the human rights record of the country is at stake. And now we know also the health of the nation is at stake. So those were really wonderful lessons learned. And I'm going to leave that there. I'm going to just make one more comment about the EU. I do think that we need to see EU level commitment to moving forward the right to housing. I think it only makes sense. As a region, you're quite distinct because you have governance structures, you have in place a parliament, you have accountability measures, you have human rights legislation. So that's not every region is constellated the way the European Union is. And you should use the structures that you have. You must use the structures that you have to move forward at regional level the right to housing. I also think that it makes sense because so many of the issues that are having an impact on housing within the EU are regional issues. Take, for example, the pressures on your housing system caused by migration and refugees. That's a very important piece of this puzzle. And take, for example, the way in which austerity measures have played out in Europe as a region that the European Bank has committed to in many countries and has forced on many countries. Those austerity measures have had are defining in Spain, Portugal, Italy. So lastly, I'll just say this. I've heard that the EU argues that housing is outside of its competencies in some respect. And I mean, I just reiterate what I just said. I mean, in a way, I'll reframe it. Let's ask ourselves, what is housing right now? What is housing? Housing is finance. Housing is migration, refugees. Housing is climate. Are those three things outside the competencies of the EU? Thanks so much.
Great, really great. We're a little behind schedule, so I think question-wise we'll get back to you, Leilani. But very interesting, and go straight to Kim van SPARRENTAK. I went through the list of your activities in the European Parliament. So my first question will be, how do you do it? Because you cannot be a member of that many committees and be a rapporteur. Don't spend all of your time answering that question, but perhaps at the beginning, is that even physically possible? Kim?
Well, as you can see, I'm still a person and I can still smile, so I guess I'm handling it. And of course, I have an amazing team that helps as well. I'm just the face of the team. Thank you so much for the invitation, and well, it's really an honor to be with the other guests in this panel. I've heard very interesting points already that are luckily mostly also reflected in the report. That's always a bit of the scary thing if you have to present a report that should be like proposing solutions for issues that have been tackled by the previous speakers. The report is already finished, or at least it's already been drafted. We're now working on the negotiations. So what if they would have said now very smart things that weren't in it? But I think we managed. So throughout the process of writing the report and drafting the report, I think cities have been the main stakeholders we spoke with, civil society and cities. One of the interesting things, and I think it's also what Leilani just mentioned, is that it's very often said like it's not an EU competence. But then when we speak, especially with local authorities, they can name at least 10 European rules and laws that have prohibited them from actually providing adequate and affordable housing to their citizens. So something must be wrong in this whole reasoning of we don't have the competence to do anything. And that's where we jump in with this report. It's going to be one of the first own initiative reports from this parliamentary term in the European Parliament. And the reason is that we see that in every European member state, there are too many people struggling to pay rent. More than 700,000 people sleep rough everywhere in Europe. Over 80 million people in the EU are overburdened by housing costs. And the numbers that I just mentioned are the numbers from before the start of the pandemic, so they're even growing. And I think in that sense, this report couldn't come at a better time, because we know that the situation in the housing crisis is only going to increase because of the COVID pandemic. On the other hand, we do see, which has also already been mentioned by the other speakers, that the COVID-19 crisis and the need to go into lockdown for your health has really helped also put some extra power into the debate, especially when it comes to homelessness. It's very often a point that we see in several member states where we don't like homelessness, so we should criminalize it. And I think that's a tendency that we really don't want to go. And therefore, there's also a very strong call in my report to make sure that that's not possible anymore in the EU. I guess what we have found out as the most difficult and painful part is that the right to actually make a lot of profit with housing has a stronger fundament in European rules and regulations than the right to having a roof over your head. And this is what we want to change. And we have to try to get all these rules and regulations and put forward commentary and recommendations to change them into such a way that from now on, we are going to treat housing as a fundamental right in the European Union. So I will mention a few of the points that we are calling for within this report. The first point, and I think this is really going to be a very important point to continue working on also after the report has been adopted, is to set a European goal of eradicating homelessness by 2030. There is a very strong will to tackle homelessness. We know that the European Commission will come with an action plan on the European Pillar of Social Rights. And we know that there's willingness from the Commission and from several member states to really be ambitious on this point. But for now, it hasn't been as concrete. And that's why we're really trying to get this goal to eradicate homelessness by 2030, because this assault on human dignity and this extreme form of poverty is just unacceptable. In order to achieve this goal, we hope that the EU will propose an EU framework for national homelessness strategies. And this basically means that every member state has to create a plan and explain to the Commission how they are going to tackle homelessness by 2030, and in this way to prioritize the provision of permanent housing to homeless people, and then, as I said, putting an end to the criminalization of homelessness. Then the second call we're making is to take action to fight evictions and create inclusive housing markets. One of the main things we see all across the European Union is the rising financialization of the housing market. The fact that right now housing is treated more and more as a tradable asset to make profits with. This really is something that we need to change. And the EU policies in different domains have such an important impact on this evolution. We see that many of the recommendations has been to just sell off some of your social housing, just to make sure that your budget looks better. So we really have to change this. And next to that, we need to, I propose that member states and local authorities put in place better tax measures to counter speculative investments. And on top of that, I think too many tenants have no idea who are actually the owners of their property. And that's why we're also really asking for more transparency on real estate ownership. Another important part, of course, if we really want to tackle the housing crisis, is to increase Europe's affordable housing stock. And in order to do so, we really need to take several steps. We need to make sure that we can actually provide social housing and public housing to a very large group. And that's why we really hope that the target group definition of social and publicly funded housing in the rules on services of general economic interest will be broadened. Because this really enables regions and local authorities to build more social housing and provide it to a wider group. Then I think it's really important that we really prioritize the Green Deal in what we're doing here. The Commission has just proposed a renovation wave, and it can provide such an important, can play such a big role in providing healthy, adequate, and accessible housing, reducing energy costs, and really helping alleviate energy poverty. And next to that, we get emission reductions through housing renovation, and especially in the social housing sector and for worst performing buildings, this can have a huge high potential to achieve these combined goals. Then next to that, we now also know that so many people have worries about their labor market, and this renovation wave can also tackle these worries and increase the amount of jobs in the European Union. And then lastly, I think one of the points that has already been mentioned is the issue with short-term holiday rentals, Airbnb, Booking.com. How do we deal with this? European regulations are really strict on what we can actually do, what local authorities can actually do, and really tackle this issue, especially when it comes to illegal renting. I think one of the things that we are working on right now is to try to embed this also in the Digital Services Act, to make sure that cities can, for example, become trusted flaggers on Airbnb, so that as soon as they say, hey, this house can't be rented out anymore, they will immediately, then we will see immediate action from platforms such as Airbnb. And next to that, there should be better collaboration and more possibilities to actually have some sort of a system in the website that blocks people from renting out the houses when they've already been rented out for more than was allowed by the city's regulations. I think just to close off my presentation of the report, one of the most interesting discussions I've been having throughout the writing of this report and all the times that I've presented this report is the question that I'm getting because I'm a Green, I'm in the Green group of the European Parliament. We're known for being very pro-European, and I am very pro-European, but a lot of the things I'm proposing here is giving more power to the local authorities to make sure that they can provide accessible and affordable housing, because local authorities have the best ideas of what their citizens need. Someone in the Commission in Brussels has a much less clear idea of the people who are living somewhere, or and what they need and what the situation of them is. So this is something that I've been realizing a lot, that one of the things that I am doing right now is getting less power from European Union and putting it back in the hands of the cities. And I think that's a positive thing, because when we're looking at the European internal market, one of the main things it has focused on is making sure that companies big corporations can make a profit, and the human element has been forgotten very often. And this is something that I think is very strong within cities, within municipalities. And that's why I think we should bring the European possibilities together with, the humanity of cities. And in that way, we can really try to tackle the housing crisis on a European level. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. And we now have 25 minutes left, sharp, not a minute more. And I'm starting to receive a few questions from participants. Please do write your questions in the Q&A field if you have any. I can see Lucia is still with us. I was afraid that you would be leaving by now, but so I will go to you first. I can see someone asked, what is the biggest obstacle for stopping forced evictions? And who are the biggest opponents? The courts that pass the resolutions, the Catalan police that enforce them? And is there any strategy to face these obstacles?
I was answering that. Estaba escribiendo en el chat porque la verdad es que tengo una reunión con vecinos, porque aparte de ser concejal de vivienda, yo soy concejal de un distrito y ahora tengo que ir a una reunión con vecinos para hablar de problemas de limpieza, que son importantes también, ¿no? Porque en este momento que mucha gente está mucho tiempo en su barrio y en sus calles, es muy necesario que la limpieza funcione correctamente. O sea que, si me perdonáis, voy a acabar de responder escribiéndolo y así dejo para, ¿no?, el tiempo de exposición para mis compañeras. Yo respondo por escrito y me voy con los vecinos a hablar de limpieza. Me sabe muy mal no poder quedarme hasta el final, pero no puedo dejar a los vecinos sin esta reunión.
There's a question here that is, well, it's a big one. I think perhaps several panelists would have an answer to that. How can we, from small municipalities, fight for public housing with the small budgets we have?
I'm answering that already. I'm writing the answers. So I'm just writing the answers, and then my colleagues can complement what I'm saying by typing it. Okay?
Okay.
Thank you.
Michaela.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think this is a very valid and very important questions, because creating public and cooperative housing companies, in fact, I think this has the potential to change this crazy and in fact very brutal narrative of there is only such a thing of like social housing where the poor people live, and all the other good forms of housing where you have rental, which is uncontrolled, and home ownership. So there is like I think a need to create something like the third sector. And I think the third sector should be something that we've seen already in many countries, and especially also in many cities and regions. It is affordable for limited profit cooperative housing models. And helping cities and regions to set up such housing schemes would be, in my mind, a genuine task of the European Union as well, to enable, for instance, capacity building on local level, to enable people to exchange on how they can finance this. Very often you can find very intelligent models to finance things in a like revolving funds, using the money that is there, not taking it out for, again, some profit, but reusing it for even more housing, even more renewal. So you can all create these kind of systems, even on a very small scale. And I think we really need also EU to assist us for the smaller and smaller municipalities and towns in this.
Leilani?
Just to add, there are some interesting movements in different cities to try to create funds for social housing. So I'll give the example of Montreal. They're actually today going to be adopting a new bylaw that requires new buildings to be, I think the formula they've come up with is 25, 25, 25. So 25% social housing, 25% deeply affordable housing, and 25% affordable housing. And of course, all those things have to be defined. But where the developer refuses to do the social housing, or doesn't want to, or feels they can't, or whatever, they actually have to pay a fee, and it's a very heavy fee, so that those units could be developed elsewhere. So they put money into a fund. In other places, I've seen, for example, Vancouver, and at the regional level, British Columbia, and I've seen, I think, in Singapore, where they impose a foreign investor tax. So where there's 1% tax, or in Singapore it's very high, 18-20% tax on foreign investment, but the tax is tied directly to the provision of social housing. So you create a fund through the tax. It's not just, it doesn't become part of the general taxation funds. It gets streamed directly to housing. So that's one way when municipalities don't have much money, they can lobby for these sorts of measures to be put in place.
Right. Great. I have one for Kim about the report concern here. If it's adopted, and it will become a requirement that the member states submit a plan to eliminate homelessness, will there be safeguards to ensure that those living in homelessness aren't just bussed out or put in unsafe shelters, or that homelessness will be defined very narrowly?
Yes, we have very clear wording in the report on what is homelessness, and also on what should be the options. We are saying that the main way forward to end homelessness is the housing first system, which means that people are being put in houses and get, in case they need extra support, they will get that, and from that way we move forward. Just an adequate shelter is not a solution for homelessness, because what people don't have when they're homeless is a home, and that is what we need to provide. So if it would be up to us, completely up to us, it would mean that everyone gets a home before 2030, but at least that is what we're fighting for. And we are in very good conversations with the cabinet of Commissioner Schmid. We know Commissioner Schmid, who is in charge of this topic, is very willing to make sure that we tackle homelessness in the EU. He just doesn't want to set a date to it, and we think that putting really a moonshot strategy behind it, and really pushing for at least this part of the housing crisis to be eliminated by 2030 is not, it's definitely possible. I think also the COVID-19 crisis has already shown that a lot of the making sure that people have a roof over their head issues are basically willingness. If there is a will, there is a way. So we will just help the member states to get a little bit more will through our report.
On the role of the European Union, someone is asking whether the austerity measures that the European Union imposed on some member states and still do, can they be conceived as something that has actually made it more difficult or problematic to implement municipal housing policies? I can't think of any specific examples myself, but perhaps one of the panelists would have a go. MICHAELA?
No, I think that's, again, it's a very, very valid question. And I mean, Kim and I have been talking about how to deblock investment on local level many times. And part of the problem at the moment is that, for instance, cities do not have a seat on the table when it comes to designing those programs. And cities do not get easy access to all the funding, and cities are not enabled to combine different sources of funding. So there's a whole thing, a whole package that in fact we need, the EU still has to deliver if they want to really help cities when it comes to housing investment, but that's also for urban renewal, green recovery. I mean, that's for many other topics as well. And there is also one issue where I would say, there is one EU institution that has really done an amazing job on housing, and that was the EIB. The European Investment Bank has done a lot for housing projects across the EU. And a little side note is that I think in the last 10 years or so, 35% of all EIB loans went to the UK. So that is gonna change. But again, there very often the thresholds to address EIB financing is much too high for the smaller entities. So again, there we have to find ways to, for instance, maybe create combined banks, public housing banks in certain regions and countries, where then smaller entities again could participate. Things like that. I mean, LEILANI has mentioned such a model, I think. So there is a lot we can do, but there is also some aspects where we can also deblock investment without touching now EU money, and that is the current European semester mechanism that doesn't allow for public investment in social infrastructure at the moment without without classifying it as a debt, which is a problem. And the other aspect is obviously also the state aid problem. We have in social housing a very narrow target group definition. And here again, this has created a lot of legal unclarity and uncertainty. And here again, we should do something about it, because we have to use all the tools to deblock investment.
LEILANI?
I hope I understood the question well, but there's a direct link between the imposition of austerity measures and barriers to the realization of the right to housing for people at city level, a direct link. So if you look at what happened after the 2008 financial crisis, what was imposed was austerity, particularly in Spain and Portugal and Italy. I know the Spain and Portugal situations better than Italy, just because I've been in contact with people from those countries in a more consistent way. But, for example, one of the first things that most countries were told to do under austerity measures was to liberalize their housing sector. And by liberalize, they mean neoliberalize. And by neoliberalize, they mean get rid of any tenant protections such as long-term leases, rent freezes, those sorts of things. And by neoliberalize the rental sector, they mean invite in the big financial actors that will bring with them money, as if that's productive money, who will buy up and buy cheap debt, basically. And so that's had a direct, absolutely direct impact. They imposed the idea of golden visa programs. Well, golden visa programs, which do exist in the countries I mentioned, are absolutely a housing land grab through big dollars, corrupt money often, but not exclusively corrupt money. And that puts a huge pressure on the cost of housing in those countries. So if you look at Cyprus and Malta and Spain and Portugal, they all have very intact golden visa programs. For those who don't know what it is, it's basically you invest a certain amount of euros in property, and in return, you don't have to live there, or the residency requirements are often quite limited. And in return, what you get is residency rights and eventually even citizenship rights, only for putting your money in the country in real estate. There are other schemes, but real estate is the one that is oversubscribed, and the other schemes, like where you actually create jobs, no one does that aspect to get residency. It's all through real estate. So these are all austerity measures that have a direct impact on housing and people being able to afford housing in their cities.
I can see there are several questions about the EU's recovery funds. And I know there have been political initiatives where cities have tried to persuade or convince EU decision makers to set aside some funds to support city level initiatives on social housing or the like. So perhaps a question to MICHAELA or Kim, is it realistic at this point? Can we expect any of that recovery money to go in that direction? Yes, MICHAELA?
I think it will very much depend on the member state. If the member state has a tradition of being like, you know, urban friendly, like the Netherlands clearly are, then that will work out. In Austria, I can inform you that the urban policy has landed with the Ministry for Agriculture. So the competence for urban matters in Austria is in the Ministry of Agriculture. So now you can imagine as how much I expect from my Austrian government to involve cities in the redistribution of the recovery fund to the local level.
Yeah, I think that is indeed one of the main things, we do see that you know, the recovery fund is already politically very new and complicated, because you know, it's the first time that we're really assuming a debt together on a European level. So member states are very careful and really don't want to be too radical. I'm a bit afraid that for many member states, really setting aside part of the funding to go directly to regions and cities is going to be way too radical. But there's always hope, I guess. But I don't expect it. Perhaps in any future fund, which is hopefully not another recovery fund. But indeed, it's really up to member states, and I think if you want your member state to make to set aside parts of the funding for your city, you have to be at their doorstep every day.
There is a short question here. It's not fleshed out, but and it goes like this: is there a need of integrating immigration policy more into housing policy? Would anyone dare go first on that? LEILANI?
Well, I dare because I've already been very public about this. There is a need, but it has to be done from a human rights place. I will talk from the Canadian experience because I don't want to get into EU politics around this. I'm that smart. So in Canada, when the government decided to invite in what for our country was a large number of Syrian refugees, there was no housing policy in place. And in fact, the immigration policy really rested on or required individual households to support the incoming refugees. That's our model. So where families would get together, for example, and pool money and then sponsor a Syrian family or individual to come into the country. And with that pool of money, private money, you would help them in their first year in Canada to live. And so, of course, as a housing advocate, I approached government about that. And what I found at national level was the housing people and the immigration ministries would not talk at all. And I was saying, well, what do you think is going to happen to these families after that 1 year of support? Because those of us sponsoring Syrian refugees would make sure they had enough money to pay market rent, because we don't have social housing here. We have 9-year, 10-year wait lists. So, and I could not get those two ministries to talk. But what you don't want to happen is for migration policies to shut down on the basis of lack of housing, because people need to leave their countries for obvious and very acute human rights reasons. I mean, that's what migration and the refugee flow is about. Human rights abuses in their own countries, and looking for a place where their human rights might actually be enjoyed. So you don't want governments to say, we don't have any housing, so we're not, and have a very hard anti-immigration policy. So I say that there needs to be an integration of those concerns, but I say that from a human rights place, where you're both concerned about the human rights of the individuals and families. Now that's not always the politics of the day.
Okay, there is not so much time left. Perhaps one more question. Let me see what it reads like. Yeah. What do you think about expropriating the big housing companies? I assume that means nationalization or municipalization. Would anyone have a quick opinion on that, Michaela?
I can inform you that Vienna will never, ever sell off their municipal housing stock. Voila, fini l'histoire. And this is like, it's over my dead cold body. It's not gonna happen, yeah? But obviously, I mean, the problem is not to, renationalize things. If they're sold to Cerberus and Vonovia and Deutsche Wohnen and the Norwegian pension fund, and then don't know anymore where your landlord sits, and maybe he's in the Bahamas or somewhere else, hidden behind a very complex structure of whatever kind of things. The problem is, in the beginning, why did you sell it off? So I think that if in Austria we would say, if the milk is poured, it's poured. You cannot just put it back into your cup, but in the bottle. But try not to sell it off if you have it. I mean, this is at the moment, for instance, happening in France. Macron has forced now the HLMs to sell off 1% of the housing stock per year, which will leave them in a situation where they don't have any flexibility and possibility to move around things anymore. That's stupid. I'm sorry. It's socially not intelligent, but it's economically stupid. And I think we should also start to make the point that housing costs, when they're so high that people just have to spend 50% of their income and more on housing, this is not good for the economy as well. So maybe we should really start from a very, solid economic argumentation in this. But one of the most solid things is you should never sell it off. If it's sold, it's gone. It's gone. It's in the Bahamas.
The clock is ticking, but there is a slot for Leilani.
I love what you just said, Michaela. I totally agree. Absolutely. Now is once a city should, or a state should never sell off its public assets. That's obvious right now in the pandemic, but was obvious with the housing crisis that predates the pandemic. I actually think now is the time that cities should be trying to acquire more public assets as distressed assets come on the market. I mean, Barcelona, for example, is doing this, the notion of right of first refusal for cities, so that they can move in quickly, try to purchase those assets, whether distressed or not, any assets, move in quickly, purchase them and retain them as public assets. I think we need to grow public assets right now. Just no doubt about that.
I think that was a perfect final remark. I'm afraid we don't have time. We don't have any more time, so I'll have to wave goodbye in a second. But before that, I mean, thanks a million to the 4 speakers, to Leilani, to Michaela and Kim, and to Lucia, who unfortunately had to leave early. And thanks a lot to the organizers and the interpreters, not least. I'm sure that this was quite a job to manage 1.5 hours of this level of all these exciting intervention. So I'm gonna have to say thanks a lot on behalf of the organizers. Really great. And yeah, have a fantastic evening. I'm sure you have to run to your telly to check what goes on in the US, just like me, right? So, good. So thanks a lot and bye bye.